November 3, 1943, the Bukidnon Highlands, Mindanao, Philippines. The Japanese patrol captain pressed his fingers into the cold ash of the campfire and felt nothing. No heat, no embers, nothing but the faint ghost of a fire that had burned hours ago, maybe days. Around him, 40 armed soldiers stood in silence, rifles raised toward a wall of jungle so thick it swallowed the torchlight whole. Somewhere inside that darkness was the man they had been chasing for 17 months. Somewhere in those mountains an American was waiting. The patrol captain pulled out his map. He had done this 100 times. He had circled villages, crossed out coordinates, redrawn perimeters. His superiors had given him 50,000 soldiers, aircraft, artillery, and naval vessels to find one man hiding in a jungle. And still, that man was gone. Still, the jungle gave nothing back. The fire was cold, the camp was empty, the enemy had vanished again. What the captain did not know, what Tokyo would not understand for another 2 years, was that the American they were hunting was no longer hiding. He was everywhere. He was in the villages, he was in the markets, he was in the faces of the fishermen casting nets at dawn, and the farmers walking to their fields at dusk. He had not built a hideout. He had built a nation. And the 50,000 soldiers hunting him were already standing inside it. If you've never heard the name Wendell Fertig, stay with us. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what this one American engineer did in the jungles of the Philippines is one of the most extraordinary things any single human being has ever pulled off in the history of modern warfare. And almost no one knows his name. Wendell Fertig was not a soldier by training. He was a civil engineer from Boulder, Colorado, a man who spent his days calculating load tolerances and surveying drainage gradients. He had arrived in the Philippines in 1936 to build roads and bridges for mining companies, and in 6 years he had learned something that would later save thousands of lives. He had learned the land. He had learned the people. He had learned that Mindanao was not just an island. It was a world unto itself, 36,000 square miles of volcanic mountains, river deltas, ancient rainforest, and communities that had been surviving foreign occupation since the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. When Japan invaded the Philippines in December 1941, Fertig was 40 years old. He had no combat experience, he had no infantry training, he had spent his career building things, not destroying them. But when General William Sharp signed the surrender order for all American forces on Mindanao on May 10, 1942, Fertig made a calculation that changed everything. He stood on a hillside above a muddy road, watching 78,000 American and Filipino soldiers march toward Japanese prison camps, and he did the math. Of the tens of thousands who had surrendered after the Bataan Death March weeks earlier, thousands were already dead, bayoneted for stumbling, buried alive for stopping to drink from a roadside ditch. The numbers did not lie. Surrender was not survival. It was a slower death with the illusion of safety. Fertig turned away from the road and walked into the jungle. He had no rifle. He had no food. He had no money and no radio. He had a compass, an engineering mind, and 6 years of relationships with Filipino workers, village elders, and tribal leaders scattered across the island's interior. It was the thinnest possible foundation on which to build anything. But Fertig was an engineer. He had spent his entire career turning thin foundations into solid structures. He began to build. The jungle closed behind him like a curtain. The first weeks were brutal, in the way that only the Philippine wilderness can be brutal. The rain came in horizontal sheets. The leeches moved without sound. Malaria hit him inside the first month, the fever rising and crashing in waves, while he sheltered in the camp of an old American settler named Jacob Daichir, who had lived on Mindanao since before the turn of the century. From that camp, burning with fever, Fertig watched Japanese prisoner columns moving on the road below. He watched Filipino civilians beaten in village squares for failing to bow. He watched a country being dismantled piece by piece, its people reduced from citizens to subjects. And through the haze of fever and rain, A thought that should have been impossible began to take shape. What if the scattered Americans were not fugitives? What if they were the nucleus of something larger? What if the Filipino resistance fighters, who were already fighting in a dozen separate bands across the island, could be unified under a single command? What if an army could be assembled from the ruins of defeat, equipped with almost nothing, operating in the shadow of 50,000 enemy soldiers, and made to function as a coherent military force? It was the kind of idea that only a man with no military training would attempt. And it was the only idea with any chance of working. By July 1942, Fertig had recovered enough to move. He began making contact with Filipino officers and resistance leaders in the Northern Highlands. And immediately he faced a problem that no amount of courage could solve on its own. The resistance was not unified. It was fractured along lines so deep they predated the war by generations. Christian Filipinos in the north distrusted the Moros of the south, Muslim communities who had been fighting every foreign power that had ever landed on their shores since the 1500s. Highland tribal groups trusted no one at all. Former Philippine Army officers competed with civilian militia commanders. Some bands were fighting the Japanese, others were fighting each other. A few were quietly preying on the civilian population under the cover of war. Fertig understood that no Filipino commander could bridge those divisions. The rivalries ran too deep. The wounds were too old. But an American, a representative of the nation that had promised liberation, that had pledged to return, might be able to do what no local leader could. He needed rank. In the Philippines, rank was not symbolic. It was the architecture of authority. Filipino soldiers would not follow a lieutenant colonel when colonels and generals were scattered across the island. So Wendell Fertig did something that had no precedent in the history of the United States Army. He found a Filipino metalsmith in the mountains south of Lake Lanao, handed him 2 silver coins, and watched the man work through the night. By morning, Fertig pinned 2 silver stars to his collar. By dawn on September 12, 1942, Brigadier General Wendell Fertig declared himself commander of all United States forces in the Philippines, Mindanao. By noon, the Japanese had heard the announcement and placed his name at the top of their most wanted list. The stars changed everything. They were ridiculous. They were unauthorized. MacArthur would furiously reject the self-promotion when he finally learned of it. But on Mindanao, those 2 coins hammered into stars unlocked doors that nothing else could have opened. A Filipino constabulary captain named Louis Morgan, half American and half Filipino, came to Fertig within weeks. Morgan had been fighting the Japanese with a small armed band since the surrender and understood the island's political landscape with surgical precision. He became Fertig's executive officer and translator, not just of language, but of culture, of loyalty, of the invisible map of trust and grievance that determined who would fight and who would inform. With Morgan beside him, Fertig began the impossible work of building an army. The Moros of the southern provinces were first. Their leaders had refused to cooperate with any outside force for 400 years. Fertig rode into their territory alone, or as alone as a man could be with a single Filipino escort, and he sat with their datas, their chieftains, and he did not ask them to fight for America. He asked them to fight for Mindanao. He listened to 4 centuries of grievances in an afternoon and promised nothing he could not deliver. When he left, the Moros agreed to coordinate. It was the most significant diplomatic achievement on the island since the Spanish had given up trying to conquer them in 1896. By late 1942, Fertig commanded something that technically resembled an army, though only barely. His forces carried ancient Springfields, homemade shotguns, and bolo knives. Some units had a single bullet per man against Japanese machine gun emplacements. Supply chains ran through triple canopy jungle on the backs of porters and the wheels of carabao carts. Every village that helped them was a village at risk of Japanese reprisal. Every informant inside the Japanese-controlled cities was one bad day away from execution. The organization was built entirely on trust, and trust in an occupied country is the most fragile substance on Earth. What Fertig needed above everything else was a radio, not a receiver, a transmitter, something powerful enough to reach MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, over 2,000 miles away, across open water, from inside a jungle being patrolled by 50,000 enemy soldiers. He found his answer in a Filipino electrical engineer named Placido Almendrez, a man who had spent the pre-war years maintaining equipment at a mining operation and who had, in the quiet of his own judgment, hidden a collection of vacuum tubes and copper wire before the Japanese could confiscate them. For months, Almendrez worked in a concealed clearing beneath a canopy so dense it blocked aerial observation, assembling a transmitter from salvaged vehicle parts, stripped wire, and a small gasoline generator. The antenna was strung between two trees and dressed with vines. The entire station could be broken down and carried by hand in under 30 minutes. In February 1943, Almendrez powered the transmitter for the first time. The signal was thin, erratic, fighting through thousands of miles of open Pacific atmosphere. Fertig sent one message into the static, a short burst of identification and coordinates, a cry into the void from a man the United States Army had written off as either dead or delusional. Then, silence. Weeks of silence in which the jungle made its usual sounds: rain, insects, distant artillery, the occasional crackle of small arms fire from a patrol ambush somewhere in the hills. Fertig waited. The reply came 23 days later, faint, crackling, barely distinguishable from noise. MacArthur's headquarters had received his signal. They were skeptical. They asked questions that only the real Wendell Fertig could answer: his wife's name, his hometown, his engineering postings before the war. He answered each one correctly. MacArthur's intelligence officers still debated whether this was a trap, a Japanese deception operation using a captured American as bait. But Commander Charles Parsons, a naval intelligence officer who had lived in the Philippines before the war, convinced them it was worth investigating. In March 1943, the USS Tambor surfaced off the northern coast of Mindanao under a moonless sky, and Parsons stepped ashore into the dark. What he found in the highlands stunned him. Fertig had not built a guerrilla band. He had built an institution. A civil government administered justice and collected taxes in guerrilla-controlled territory. Court settled disputes. Settled. A postal service carried mail between towns. Schools taught Filipino children in English. Hospitals treated the wounded. And a currency, guerrilla pesos, printed on whatever paper could be found, circulated through markets because Fertig had given his personal word that when MacArthur returned, the United States would honor every single note at face value. It was a promise no one had authorized him to make. The Filipinos believed it anyway, because Fertig had never broken a smaller one. Parsons returned to Australia and told MacArthur's headquarters a single, blunt truth. This man was not insane. He was the most effective unconventional warfare commander they had ever encountered, and they needed to support him immediately. The submarines began arriving: USS Thresher, USS Bowfin, USS Narwhal. Each vessel surfaced in darkness off hidden beaches and offloaded crates of M1 rifles, ammunition, radio equipment, and medical supplies. Fertig's logistics network moved those crates inland on small boats up river channels, then on carabao carts along jungle trails, then on the backs of porters to guerrilla camps hidden deep in the highlands. Every step of that supply chain crossed territory where Japanese patrols could appear at any moment. The Japanese knew something had changed. The guerrilla attacks were no longer random harassment. They were coordinated strikes on specific targets. Bridges vanished in the night. Telephone cables between major garrisons were cut, and then cut again when repair crews arrived. Japanese officers being transported between cities in staff cars were ambushed at predictable intervals along predictable roads. Intelligence was leaking out of occupied cities with a speed and accuracy that suggested the enemy had agents inside their own command structures. In 1943, Japanese headquarters in Manila launched a major offensive into the highlands. 3 infantry columns pushed from different directions. Aircraft bombed suspected guerrilla camps. Naval vessels blockaded the coastline. Fertig had prepared for exactly this. His forces did not fight. They dissolved. Guerrilla units fractured into small groups and dispersed into the jungle along routes that appeared on no Japanese map. Radio equipment was buried, documents were burned, headquarters staff scattered to prearranged locations. Fertig himself moved constantly, changing sleeping positions every night, guided by Filipino scouts who navigated by landmarks that had no names in any language the Japanese spoke. The Japanese columns moved deeper into the mountains and found cold fire pits, abandoned camps, and empty supply caches. The jungle answered their search with silence. Then it answered with ambushes on isolated patrols, with supply lines cut by bombs made from unexploded Japanese ordnance, with sentries disappearing in the night without a sound. After 6 weeks, the offensive collapsed under the weight of malaria, exhaustion, and the grinding psychological dread of fighting an enemy who could not be fixed, could not be surrounded, and could not be made to die in a place that was convenient. The Japanese withdrew. Within days, Fertig's forces reoccupied their positions. Radio stations returned to the air, supply routes reopened, and civil government resumed. It happened again in October 1943 and early 1944, each offensive larger than the last, each ending the same way. Japanese commanders finally understood they were not fighting an army, but a population. Every farmer on Mindanao was a potential spy, every village a depot, every trail an ambush. Controlling the island required forces they did not have, and every burned village drove more young men into the hills. By mid-1944, intelligence estimated Fertig led 30,000 guerrillas. The true number was closer to 35,000, not counting civilians who carried messages, hid supplies, and watched the coasts. He had built loyalty deeper than fear. When MacArthur returned in October 1944, landing on Leyte, Fertig's network of 58 radio stations fed real-time intelligence to American commanders. Japanese ships were tracked and destroyed. On April 17, 1945, the 24th Infantry Division landed at Parang expecting brutal resistance. Instead, guerrillas had cleared the beaches and trapped defenders in the highlands. Filipino fighters guided American troops inland, with the calm of men who had already fought 3 years. Resistance collapsed within weeks. The 50,000-man garrison shattered, driven into mountains. Fertig was later honored, but on Mindanao, he was remembered for something greater. He had given his people belief. He stayed when surrender seemed easier, and that choice changed the fate of an island, forever and always. Fertig returned to Colorado a quiet man. He ran a mining company. He gave no speeches. He sought no publicity. He never wrote his own account of the war. He died on March 24, 1975, at the age of 74, having allowed other men to tell his story while he went back to the work of building things. But his influence outlasted his silence. The psychological warfare doctrine he helped develop at Fort Bragg in the early 1950s became the foundational philosophy of the United States Army Special Forces. Every Green Beret who has ever been trained to organize a resistance movement, to win a population's trust before asking for its sacrifice, to build legitimacy before asking for loyalty, carries something of Fertig inside the doctrine they were taught. One military historian placed him among the 10 greatest guerrilla commanders in all of recorded history, alongside names that carry centuries of legend. A mining engineer from Colorado who had never commanded troops in battle before 1942 was ranked beside Lawrence of Arabia. It is the kind of comparison that sounds absurd until you consider the numbers. 50,000 soldiers, 3 years, 35,000 men built from nothing. An island liberated before the invasion force even landed. Some accomplishments are too large to be captured by any single statistic. They can only be understood through the story of one man standing in a jungle clearing, looking at a cold campfire, and choosing to walk deeper into the dark rather than back into the light of a prison camp. Wars are not won by firepower alone. They are won by the quiet, grinding, patient work of building trust in places where trust has been destroyed. They are won by the people who understand that an occupied country is not a conquered country as long as one person inside it refuses to believe the occupation is permanent. Wendell Fertig understood that with a clarity that 50,000 soldiers, no matter how well armed, could never overcome. They hunted him for 3 years across 36,000 square miles of jungle and mountain and swamp. They never found him, not because he was hiding, because by the time they were looking, he was already everywhere.